and welcome to The View on the Streets with me, Marisa Pereira. Now that the dust has settled after the general election that took place on June the 8th, which resulted in a hung parliament, we went to two different areas to speak to voters and find out what do they make of their results. Hackney, a safe Labour seat, which voted Remain in the EU referendum, and Epping, which voted Conservative and Leave. To get some analysis of the issues raised by the public, I am delighted to have with us Tom Slater. Tom is deputy editor of the online magazine Spiked. But first of all, let's take a look at people's responses.
So what are your views on the general election results?
I was really happy that Jeremy Corbyn kind of won these elections in a way. I mean, Theresa May just wanted to have a broad majority, and this didn't happen. Political things are changing in UK, and young people especially are really getting involved, which is great. But people are saying, no, actually we don't want another Tory government, kind of. This minority government that they're trying to form with this crazy party, the UP. I didn't even know that they existed, and they're just crazy, they don't represent anybody.
I think it was a pretty good result overall. I think it definitely shows a swing back to a form of politics, which I'm a fan of. I remember the sort of early days, I suppose, of Tony Blair and how exciting and hopeful that was. But I think what became more and more apparent is how much they were swinging towards kind of Thatcherism and really entangled with neoliberalism. I just think it's probably about time for that switch back leftwards toward Labour.
Theresa May, she should admit that she turned the majority into a minority. That's a defeat. She can't connect. She really should step aside. But she loves power. Don't love power more than you love the people you're supposed to be serving. I thought May's campaigning style was absolutely atrocious, and I think people saw through her quite early. I saw through her. She never answers a question, ever. She will just say what she wants to say, and never give a yes or no.
Usually I wouldn't be too interested. I voted Labour, and just forget about it. But I actually came in on the night of the election and started to watch on the TV, and I think because of the exit poll, it's just funny to see the analysts and all these smart people stunned and just seeing their faces and trying to find reasons why this is happening. Theresa May doesn't look like someone who would dress in a hat like this or put on some Nike stuff, She just, how can she connect with young people? She's got nothing in common with them. What's she got in common with them, honestly?
Well, I think Theresa May got a good kicking that she deserved from the electorate. She was arrogant and she assumed that everyone was going to vote for her, and she got what she richly deserved. I think that getting into bed with the DUP is exactly what Theresa May was criticising Jeremy Corbyn for. She said that he was guilty of colluding with terrorists, and now she's doing exactly the same thing.
Not surprised, really. By what was been going on throughout the election process, you knew it wasn't going to be one party or another. You knew it was going to be a similar tie sort of thing. So.
And were you happy with that?
No, not at all. We needed a strong party to go through all the processes that we're going through with Brexit and everything else. I did vote Conservative. I'm not really sure about Corbyn's he's promised a lot of things. I think the young people have voted for him because of some of the things that he's offered in his manifesto. Years ago I voted Labour, I was Labour, but I've seen we've seen through my age, I've seen various parties and what they've actually done and what they haven't done for you and what they've promised and what you haven't received through those promises.
I'm happy with the result that we ended up with, but I would have preferred it to have been somewhere between where we ended up as a blue wearer, where we wanted to be. At the risk of sounding bitter, I think that it's very easy to get the younger voters interested by saying let's free everything, right? Let's free education, free homes, free healthcare, all of those things. Very easy to do, but someone's going to have to pay for it. And what's even more amazing is that they didn't fall for the fact that it would be them paying for it in 10 and 20 and 30 years' time.
I was walking to work the other day in the elections and I saw the amount of people, young people queuing in the polling, and it was really impressive. I didn't have the opportunity to vote, but I was really proud of our generation.
This particular generation gap was the reason for the results of the election. Actually, I think that young people are in general more aware of the political troubles in the country, and that's why they just decided to go and vote, and the results, the good results for the Labour Party were the consequence of these actions. We stand for more liberal views, we maybe are pro-Europe, and we think that in general our voice matters for the future.
How would you feel about a sort of generation divide between the young and the old?
The youth and the older generation have always had a difference of opinion. You'll get the occasional voter that will vote in the way of their parents, but I think that certain parties often reflect the views of the youth slightly better than the other, and yeah, it's not a big surprise.
I mean, there's a lot of assumption made by age, but I think there always has been this, people move more to the right as they get older. I think that's always, it's a bit of a dangerous assumption, but I don't think there's a generational divide.
Young people are the people more than anything that suffered from property prices, that have suffered from having to pay tuition fees. I didn't. So all those messages from Corbyn were really on point. I'm afraid just personally, I still remember the Blair years, so I don't trust the Labour Party in general.
Well, I think most of the young people now, they have no idea what it is to have a socialist government. Even with Labour under Blair, it was more like a conservative Labour Party. All this, the young people standing up for in particular for Corbyn, I think it's a bit of a wave. It's a bit of emotion at the moment. I think that he's promised an awful lot, and whether he can deliver that if he ever becomes Prime Minister, I think most people will get a big shock. But the young people are entitled to their say like anybody else,
Me personally, it was a good result because I just think everything's a little bit unclear in terms of the Tory policies. I think it was very much an arrogant approach maybe in terms of calling it such a short notice. So I just thought the public picked up on that quite quickly, and it's quite naive to expect people just to vote so soon after the Brexit vote.
What are the risks for Brexit in terms of this result?
Nothing much has changed from that point of view. I just think you just have to get on with it now. The decision's been made, and like anything, you just got to get on with it and start to move the process forward. There's no point in crying about it. You just have to get on with it. My concern is that at the moment it's kind of limbo again, and the sooner the better, regardless of who wins what. It's just let's just get on with a good negotiation, and from that point things will start to move forward. If Jeremy Corbyn was the Prime Minister now, he'd have the same problem in his hands. He'd have to go ahead with Brexit and make steps in that direction. I think that's all completely irrelevant. That decision was made a year ago now, and I think in another year's time we may be having the same conversation. So whether it's Jeremy Corbyn, whether it's Cable or Theresa May, it's irrelevant. Get on with it.
I thought it was a good result because everybody was expecting a Conservative landslide and it wasn't. So it's kind of a wake-up call. My impression is I don't think people really want a hard Brexit, and so I read it as a vote for something slightly softer, because the Conservatives are very kind of gung-ho. It's going to be a hard Brexit, and I think most of us, well, I don't know, everybody I know and myself would like something a bit milder.
What do you think is the impact of this result on Brexit?
First of all, it will have a bit of an effect, but I think that will go. I think the country will realise that watering it down is not the way to go. We've either got to go in strong or don't bother. Just walk away from it. We've got to be strong. Britain has to be strong if we're going to get anything like a fair result.
Now May has gone in with even less power behind her than she did before, so it's even more chaotic. Though I didn't vote to leave, we have voted, so that's fair enough, and I think now that it's going to be not from a position of strength.
I don't think Theresa May is for Brexit. I think that she was given a set of cards that she was dealt, because prior to Brexit neither Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn were pro-Brexit. I do think that Theresa May would have gone more for Brexit given a majority vote. However, with Jeremy Corbyn now in it, I hope that it does soften the Brexit.
I'm very proud of British that they've made first move pushing European Union into democratization and also into revising their ways of governing other countries. This is not only unaccountable in a sense that they are not elected, but it's also a bunch of people who are making a lot of money out of those positions. You will see it when the bill will come, how much they are charging for each person.
I'm not happy about the way Brexit went in the first place, so I'm pretty sure that this is probably going to make Brexit worse. I'm not sure what the role is of the rest of Parliament either in terms of being able to ameliorate that, and I'm also pretty sure that the will of the people, as it were, isn't going to be particularly paid much attention to in those negotiations.
How can Theresa May turn up to a table in Brussels and try and negotiate any sort of deal now when she's lost all credibility? She's tried to get a mandate from the British people. That hasn't happened. It's weakened our hand overall. Even negotiating a deal with a minor party to get a majority in Parliament, she's buggered that up as well. Negotiation, terrible negotiation. It's a fucking outrage.
I'm a bit worried about the hung parliament, if I'm honest, because we've got a Conservative minority. However, they've got into bed with people that are anti-abortion, homophobic. That doesn't really bode well for our country, which is, you know, struggling as it is with things that to do with anti-racism, anti-immigration. So I'm just a bit worried about like how this is actually going to pan out and whether this is going to actually negatively affect the people.
Hung parliament, DUP, regardless of your opinion on them, it's not efficient, is it? And I think that's exactly what we needed, a strong mandate for a Brexit negotiation. So messy is what I'd say it was, I think. I have faith in the political process, as it were, and I think the Brexit decision will still be carried out, but to what extent, I don't know. I mean, May has already said about guaranteeing full benefits to EU citizens that are here now, and I think that's a good way to start, but the ball's in their court, and Brussels has got the leverage. They've got a higher economic power in Germany and France, and we're the smaller fish. Like I say, I think we needed a mandate, and we didn't get it. It is worrying somewhat. I voted for Brexit myself. There were economists that said it wasn't the best idea, and I didn't vote for it for an economic point of view. I did it because of the principles I have. I felt that democracy and principles of democratic freedom were greater than the economic incursion, and I don't feel like the economic cost has been as great as initially expected. So again, still optimistic, but there is a strong, powerful force in the 48%, and their voices should be heard. But like I say, it's a democratic referendum, and it was won by the Brexit vote.
So Tom, even though many predicted a Tory landslide, Labour actually did better than many people predicted. So what is behind this result?
The British public don't like being taken for granted and delight in defying expectations. I think it's fair to say that this was Theresa May's race to lose. It wasn't just a kind of polling blip that she went from a 20-point lead to a hung parliament. And I think really what that speaks to is the incompetence of the Tory party in this campaign, and also its failure to really latch on to the Brexit spirit, which it at first seemed to be trying to do. At the beginning of the campaign, Theresa May did quite well in kind of trying to speak to the Brexit vote at a time in which it had no other validation or support amongst any other sections of the political class. But what happened, I think, is she started to confuse Brexit's popularity for her own popularity and treated the electorate to the sort of campaign which really sums up everything I think a lot of people hate about the political class. So the robotic sound bites, the sense that this was all about positioning and messages rather than any substance. And I think that really switched a lot of people off. It just reminds us, post-Brexit, how much our political class are incapable of really meeting the aspirations of not just the people who voted Leave last summer, but people in general, that they're crying out for something a bit different. This is our third election since 2010, and we're looking at a hung parliament with neither party really being able to command support of enough of the public. So I think it just shows that, again, that gap between the public and the politicians is as wide as it ever has been, and that's something that we really need to redress.
Many are suggesting this is a return to the two political parties. What do you have to say about that?
In this election, what we're really seeing is the two parties may still be there, but it's really only because there's no alternatives, because there's really no content to either of those two parties now, no clear constituency, no clear set of ideas. And whilst they might stand, it only just speaks to the fact of the lack of alternatives that we have at this point.
So what do you say to those that suggest that actually Labour's manifesto was very radical, and that was one of the reasons why Corbyn got such a great result?
I think to call this manifesto radical is just a smear on radicalism itself. I mean, one commentator referred to it as microwave Miliband, and I think that's a pretty good way to describe it. This is kind of state socialism light, nothing particularly ambitious about it. And I think also there's been all these kinds of comparisons to Michael Foot's manifesto, the quote-unquote longest suicide note in history, which wasn't that radical to begin with, but at least that had some core principles on it. If you think about someone like Corbyn, the most radical thing he ever said was that we should get out of the European Union, that this European-wide order is a terrible thing and it's anti-democratic, neoliberal, whatever. And he jettisoned that from his own politics and largely from his manifesto, which stuck this very equivocal kind of pose to try and basically elude the question of Brexit altogether. So whilst there's some things in there which are a little bit slightly out of the mainstream, I think that only speaks to how narrow the mainstream really is, because there's nothing really in that manifesto that is particularly transformative.
There's a lot of Labour voters that are celebrating this as if it was a victory, even though they lost. And a lot of people we spoke to on the streets in Hackney were really happy with it. So what do you make about that?
I think what it really speaks to again is that how distant Labour still are from power, from commanding the support of the vast majority of the vote. And I think what a lot of people have confused for is a lot of enthusiasm in the media, amongst the cultural set, for enthusiasm amongst ordinary people who I think a lot of them voted for Corbyn's Labour Party with a peg on their nose.
The Tories made huge gains in poor areas like Boston, whereas Labour actually made huge gains in places like Kensington, Hampstead, Canterbury, very wealthy areas. What does that say about the two political parties?
That's the thing I think Labour politicians, Labour supporters really need to look at in this election, because it is staggering. Labour at this election did better amongst not only middle class people but pretty wealthy people than they ever have done at any election ever. And I think that really speaks to the kind of existential crisis that faces Labour. Over the past 20, 30 years, Labour's support amongst working class people has been steadily declining. You kind of see a couple of upticks around 97, 2015, but really it's been a picture of Labour becoming an increasingly bourgeois party, not really for workers but for public sector workers. What's interesting about Corbyn is a lot of people prized him, you know, the man who's going to stick up for the many and not the few, who's going to put Labour back onto its pro-worker type of footing. He's sped up that process more than anything else. And I think what that really speaks to is that Labour's message going into this election, I think, boiled down to two things more broadly, one of which is welfare and the maintenance of public services, and the other thing was this anti-austerity message. That message has much more resonance with middle class people than it does with the people who actually feel the effects of austerity, who actually have to live under the welfare system. It appeals more than anything not to a sense of working class aspiration but to a sense of middle class moralism, and it's putting off the sort of people that Labour was supposed to traditionally represent. That's a huge problem for Labour, and I think they ignore it at their peril.
A lot of the people we spoke to in Hackney were extremely happy with the youth turnout, and we know that Labour made a huge deal out of persuading young people to go to the ballot box.
I think the obsession with the youth vote going into this election was incredible, but mainly because of how incredibly cynical it was. Now, the enthusiasm for young people coming out to vote wasn't really based in wanting to inspire young people, a concern that there was a whole generation who weren't really that switched on. It's a product of a party and a section of politics which seems to have lost the argument with everyone else and so needs to beg young people to vote for it. So there's a very cynical aspect to all of this. And also, when you talk about young people voting Labour, I think they're talking about a very specific type of young person. I struggle to believe that a 21-year-old living in Stoke, trying to get by, sees the same thing in Jeremy Corbyn that the young people of Kensington or Canterbury do. So I think we need to take this with a bit of a pinch of salt and also see how, in many ways, cynical the obsession with youth turnout has become for the left.
A lot of the people we spoke to, both in Hackney and in Epping, saw young people as either quite liberal and more open-minded than their elders, or quite naive. Is there a generational divide emerging, and should this worry us?
Well, there's certainly a generational divide emerging if you look at some of the polling. I mean, one of the fascinating things about this election was that your age seemed to be one of the biggest determining factors as to who you were going to vote for, whether it was Labour or the Tories. So it's certainly starting to have some purchase on how people vote, but I think the dynamic which is being kind of stoked here, mainly by the Labour Party and the left, is actually quite a grim one. You get this sense that older people, baby boomers, have kind of stolen young people's future by using up all the houses and the resources and all the rest of it, which is a really ugly and ridiculous way to look at these things. And then also in relation to the Brexit vote, we saw this horrendous kind of ageist arguments after the vote suggesting that all these old wrinklies had effectively stolen young people's futures. And there was serious talk about whether old people should almost be denied the vote. My concern is that it seems to be generated out of a very concerted attempt to kind of whip up generational grievance to the end of gaining support for one side. And I don't think that's useful for politics. First of all, to pit generations against one another, but again, I think it mystifies the issues that confront all of society, which have actually precious little to do with age.
A lot of the people we spoke to in Hackney talked about the deal that was being done between the DUP and the Tories and were quite fearful about it. But are those fears justified in your point of view?
I think the fear-mongering about the DUP deal has been incredibly unedifying, and it's also kind of historically illiterate. I mean, various governments have sought the support of the DUP in order to prop up minority governments or form coalitions. In 2010 and 2015, Labour put out feelers to the DUP to try and gain support to try and form a government. So to turn around now and to suggest that it's this kind of horrendous deal, I think is a little bit ridiculous. But I also think it's driven by two quite unpleasant prejudices, particularly about Northern Ireland and Northern Irish voters. One of which is to kind of treat them as the kind of hillbillies of the UK, that this deal is going to lead to abortion being kind of outlawed in England and Wales, and that gay marriage is going to be rolled back. All of this is ridiculous, and I think it's really just sped on by kind of fear and distrust of those voters in Northern Ireland. And the second really ugly part of it is this idea that the DUP deal would kind of destroy the peace process, which is this really kind of horrendous idea that if it wasn't for the British standing in the middle and kind of playing referee, that people in Northern Ireland would suddenly be at each other's throats. It's ridiculous to suggest of where Northern Ireland actually is right now, but also plays into this very age-old kind of Troubles era prejudice, which is that they are these kind of ape-like creatures who are just waiting to kick off if there isn't the grown-up in the room, Britain, there to kind of look after them.
In Hackney, a lot of the people saw this result as a victory for soft Brexit, whereas those interviewed in Epping actually didn't really see a threat in this result and suggested that Brexit is going to go ahead regardless. And I thought this is quite interesting, but I would like to find out what you think.
Well, I actually think that's one of the biggest dangers right now for Brexit, because I think going into this election, a lot of Leave voters, quite understandably, who were told that Brexit was settled, that it was going to be upheld, both of the parties trying to make positive noises about that, went into this, I think, not realising how much it was at threat, because there was certainly a lot of Remain voters, particularly in London, particularly in metropolitan areas and cities, who saw this as an opportunity to try and push for a soft Brexit, to try and derail it to some degree. And you see loads of examples of that, one of which was there was a poll which looked at people who read different newspapers who vote for a particular party. Out of readers of the Financial Times, the biggest number of them voted Labour this time around, and I don't think that's for a 50p rate of tax. It's clearly that a lot of people see an opportunity to unseat Brexit, and I think after the result we've seen the attempt to kind of weaponise what remains a quite inconclusive general election result to that end. So many of the commentators who throughout the entire election campaign were saying that Brexit is a done deal, that we don't need to talk about it, that anyone raising concerns about it was just being hysterical, immediately leapt on the result to say Brexit isn't a done deal, and this election result proves that. And I think one of the big dangers right now is that Brexit is less defended and less stuck up for than it ever has been. What we really need to do is re-engineer that sense of public vigilance about Brexit to make sure that it is carried through.
On that note, I'd like to thank Tom Slater for such a great interview. And if you would like to join us in a future programme, please email us.